Welcome to the GS Podcast. I'm Stephen Knight. I hope you're all well. How's everyone enjoying living in Corona country right now? That seems to be all that is on everyone's mind. It occupies our news cycle 24/7, and it's difficult to know how that's going to play out. So, for what it's worth, wash your hands. Don't panic buy. You don't need that much loo. What are you doing with the loo roll is my main question. And I do think social distancing is a moral duty right now, if you can, especially if you can work from home. I'm doing my best to do that, so I fully intend to be working from home for the foreseeable future. But if you've reached coronavirus fatigue in terms of all the content coming your way related to that, fear not, because this episode has nothing to do with it. And I've actually got another 3 or so episodes recorded that have nothing to do with it. So there you go. Bit of something to take your mind off it. I think me and Aaron will probably record a Taking the Myth sometime soon, so we'll probably dedicate a sizable chunk of that to the coronavirus, assuming society hasn't devolved into some 28 days later nonsense. We'll see how that goes. But this episode, I have two great guests. I don't know, for those of you tuning into the BBC Big Questions, a couple of episodes back, Jimmy Bangash was on. Jimmy is a human rights activist, calls himself a gem, a gay ex-Muslim, which I really like. He's been on the podcast before. If you haven't heard that episode, definitely check it out after this one. And joining us as well will be Emma Webb. Emma was on the same episode of the BBC Big Questions, spoke a lot of sense, and she's the director of Forum on Integration, Democracy and Extremism for Civitas. Really enjoyed having her on for the first time. Very smart, knows her stuff. So we're going to be talking about the issue we have with the term Islamophobia in the UK at the moment, and various groups wishing to define on our behalf what that term means and what we can and can't say about an ancient religion and its key figures. And we're not having it. And I doubt many of you are either. So I really enjoyed this chat. And if you've got any thoughts, feedback, follow-up questions for my guest, just some general love you'd like to send in their direction, you can find Emma on Twitter at Emma_A_Webb with a double B. And you can find Jimmy on Twitter at GEEMME. Send him some love, send him some feedback, send him some kind words. Emma references a report Civitas carried out on the definition of Islamophobia recently. Well worth a read. I've put a link to that in the show notes. It's a PDF. So read it is my advice. It's not, socially isolating yourself, aren't you? You might as well read it. What else are you going to do? You can keep up to date on this podcast at gspellchecker.com. This show is entirely listener supported. I don't run any ads, I don't sell you anything, and if society crumbles in the face of this pandemic, I may need the money to pay the rent. So if you like what you hear and you don't want me to starve, it's not going to happen anytime soon. Lots of pasta and beans in the cupboard. But if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by visiting gspellchecker.com/support. And if anyone wants to buy any loo roll, you know where to find me. Enjoy. I'm very pleased to have two guests on this episode of the GS podcast. Returning will be Jimmy Bangash. Hi Jimmy, how you doing?
Hey, doing great. Good to be back.
Excellent.
This is my third time, I think. Yeah.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, I need some new material, don't I? Honestly.
Yeah, definitely.
It's always a pleasure. Go on.
But it's not like the same format, right? We have an additional person with us.
We do.
Which makes it even more interesting.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to have Emma Webb with us. Emma, how are you doing?
Hi, honoured.
So it's our job just to keep Jimmy on track, basically, between us. I think that'll be the biggest challenge of this podcast.
I think it will be, yeah.
Well, last time we saw each other, we was marching in honour of ex-Muslims at Pride. That was a great day out, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was a great day out, actually. And I think it was the third year. So it was the Pride just gone, wasn't it? So we'd been there. This was our third year marching at Gay Pride. I can confirm for all of your listeners that Allah is still gay.
He is a massive homosexual, isn't he?
Yeah, he is indeed. And also a lot of people are really upset about us drawing attention to his sexuality. In alignment with that, we've had quite a few, not quite a few, one actually, gay Muslim organisation go around blocking all of the ex-Muslims on Twitter. So Iman are having the first Muslim gay pride. And, as ex-Muslims, we were like, yay, we're going to come and support you and it'll be amazing. And they just blocked us all. They just blocked us all, yeah.
That's fairly sinister, but from fairly sinister to extremely sinister, you must have seen the headlines of that Islamist arrested for a terrorist plot on Pride, which thankfully didn't come to fruition. And I'm just wondering, is that him just targeting a large crowd of, there's going to be a lot of gay people there, obviously, or maybe he was aware of the actions of the ex-Muslim groups in previous years? I don't know if you're more privy to the information than I am in this regard.
Yeah, so I couldn't confirm for you what is true of that, actually, like whether he was coming to target the gay pride because of of an awareness of our activities. But I think generally speaking, and this is a conversation that came up around the Pulse shooting as well. The nightclub in America.
It's Omar Mateen.
Yeah. So, there's generally speaking that if you're going to kill the kuffar, but you're killing the gay kuffar, it's like bonus points, isn't it?
God.
Like, it's even better if you killed some gays than it would be if you just killed like normal non-Muslims in your jihad.
Gay apostates then must be a triple point multiplier.
Yeah, triple point. That is like, you probably get like 144 virgins for that, right? But I don't know. But I know we're joking about this, aren't we? But I guess the serious point to take from it is that actually from a theocracy or theology kind of point of view, what you're thinking is these are the scum, really. Killing gays are the scum, and killing them is almost like it's sanitizing the earth, really. You're doing a cleansing by killing gay people, because we know that actually, in however many Muslim majority countries, the death penalty still stands for homosexuality. So it's not even like the murder of gays is some anomalous activity. It's actually endorsed by the religion. So doing it in terms of attacking gays in this way, it wouldn't be seen as something atrocious and abhorrent.
Yeah, it's very much on brand, isn't it? It's very much on brand to attack the gays within Islamic theocracy.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
I hope you're not a member of the Labour Party, Jimmy.
No.
Going to find yourself suspended for all that Islamophobic talk.
Well, that's a lovely segue, because we will be delving into the definition proposed for Islamophobia. The awful thing about audio is you can't see me doing scare quotes when I say Islamophobia. But Emma, for my listeners who might not be completely familiar with your work, maybe you can just try and explain for them what is it that you do? How would you describe your work? What gets you out of bed in the morning?
Well, I'm the director of the Forum on Integration, Democracy and Extremism at Civitas. My sort of main area of interest is the kind of intersection between Islamist extremism and integration. So my background is in researching Islamist extremism, particularly things like domestic fundraising, how they exploit charitable organisations and that kind of thing. And the Islamophobia definition obviously falls into that, because a lot of the sort of study of Islamist extremism obviously would be somewhat damaged by the Islamophobia definition that's been proposed by the all-party parliamentary group.
Right. So, I mean, the reason that I think it's great to have you two on this episode, you were both on a recent episode of the BBC's The Big Questions, which is just, it's not great for my blood pressure, I'll be honest, but I do enjoy watching it, and I've been to a few recordings myself, and it's always lively. But I suppose my interest in this definition of Islamophobia and how it's being proposed is how it trespasses on the idea of freedom of expression. But I thought we could just start by maybe steel manning it a little bit, because I mean, I don't like the the word Islamophobia. I think it's too muddy. It conflates ideology and people. But I suppose I hope and I imagine we would all agree that anti-Muslim bigotry exists, and it's a bad thing, and we'd all want to oppose it. So let's just take Islamophobia to mean anti-Muslim bigotry for a moment. What would a reasonable definition of that be? How would you describe anti-Muslim bigotry in some sort of legislation?
Well, I think that the current legislation as it stands, and actually, interestingly, Trevor Phillips, who has just been suspended from the Labour Party on accusations of Islamophobia.
Incredible.
He actually was responsible.
This stuff up, can you? You just can't make this stuff up. He was
responsible for some of the legislation to prevent people from being discriminated against on the basis of their religion. So we already have plenty of legislation to cover that, and it's basically anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Hindu, anti-Sikh, anti-Christian. The whole lot would be covered. So you don't actually need a separate definition of Islamophobia. That's at least my understanding of it. And that would just be, as you would expect, discrimination in the normal sense. But it would be on the basis of, if somebody was a Muslim, but it wouldn't have anything to do with the kind of cultural, religious, or the realm of ideas, basically.
Jimmy, also as an ex-Muslim, somebody of non-white appearance, I would imagine any toothless racist who's going to fire any anti-Muslim bigotry anywhere, you'd be in the firing line as well. They're not going to be, they're not going to take a moment to appreciate the nuance of being an apostate, are they? So I suppose if anyone has got a good idea of how that manifests, it would be you. And I was just wondering, how much of that would you say you faced in the UK?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so apparently I've been told I'm now white passing, and I've also been accused of white adjacency, because I can't even say the words. So because often I talk about how we're actually living in the least racist country in Europe, and we're living in arguably one of the least racist societies in the world, and definitely I would say at the least racist time in human history. Yeah.
I don't know if you've sorry, I was just going to say, I don't know if you've seen actually just on that Kahinda Andrews, the Black History professor, has actually just come out on Twitter saying that, describing Trevor Phillips as formerly black.
Yeah, he called him an Uncle Tom, didn't he, as well?
Yeah, he used the phrase Uncle Tom Coonery, which I'm not sure I'm even allowed to say, but
yeah.
I mean,
it's really bad,
which I think is racist. That's racial hatred. I mean, in my opinion.
Yeah.
You know what's really interesting about this is people like him will throw the term around racist everywhere in every area of discourse you can think about. They'll even if racism doesn't manifest, obviously they'll talk about unconscious racism and things like that. Whereas when we're talking about racism, what he's done there is a cast iron example of racism to me. But even then, you were very kind of restrained in the way you describe that, to use the word racist, because to people like us, this R word means something so powerful that you've got to be so careful when you apply it, because it is that important to me. And I was just wondering, have we lost that now, really?
They seem to have a really confused understanding of ontology and existence, that they think that somebody's race is somehow dependent on what they believe. So if you don't agree with Kahinda Andrews' understanding of what black people believe, then you're no longer black. And it's the same for Jimmy, that you're, as I think it was Baroness Faulkner put it, insufficiently Muslim. Yeah. If you don't fit with a particular mold of how we understand Muslims to be, and that tends to be defined by the people on the sort of more conservative end of the spectrum. So you have people like Kanta Ahmed criticising the burqa and then being called an Islamophobe for it, even though she's a Muslim.
There's this conflation, isn't there, now, or this kind of redefining of the word racism, which is quite pernicious, actually. So I think one of the things that's happened is where we had the word racism, and then we had the term structural or institutional racism, which referred very much to things that you might find happening in institutions. Yeah, so an example of that is when you looked at indirect racism in the police force, when they had a certain height that you had to be to join the police force, and then East Asian communities were saying, actually, look, just statistically, we're not able to reach that height, so we feel like your rules that you've got around this is indirectly discriminating against East Asian people. And so, an assessment was done and that was changed and that height restriction was removed. But what we saw there was like a legitimate example of institutional racism that disadvantaged people from a certain region of the world. And so that was referred to as institutional racism. But now when people talk about racism, they often are talking about institutional racism, and the word racism has by default now become institutional racism. Mm-hmm. So what you find is people of my generation, and I'm 41, right? So I'm still used to the word racism, meaning somebody thinks that their race is superior to another race. And the person I might be having a conversation with might be 24, and he's talking about structural racism. So we're talking cross purposes in this conversation, but we're using the same word. And that doesn't help anybody in any way if we're both using the same word to mean different things. What's more pernicious now is when we're talking about racism, it's been rather than defining it as somebody thinking that their race is better than another race, what they've done now is say, racism can only exist in the context of having power and prejudice. So therefore, white people can't be experiencing racism because other races don't have power. And really what you've done is you've taken the definition of racism and excluded one race from it. And that's the classic definition of racism.
It's interesting because it's based on this kind of understanding of the hierarchy of power. Mm. And there is I'm thinking of a particular activist who was a victim of, I believe she was a victim of the Rotherham grooming scandal. Yeah. And is lobbying particularly to have it recognised that, obviously it was reported that, they were calling these girls white, slag and all sorts of horrible things. And it's not recognised that is racial, that it's anti-British, anti-Western or anti-white, because you fall at the bottom of the hierarchy. And so he was saying earlier about kind of like, in a different context about points, that it's almost as if you kind of get credit the higher up this hierarchy that you go. And it just doesn't seem to be a kind of, you can't have a real honest discussion. So you end up with this concept of racism being so completely porous that, as we saw with Trevor Phillips, it now gets to the point where you can't say anything about any Muslim group. You can't report on any. It's completely unclear as to what is safe to say and what isn't safe to say, because anything can be interpreted in any way, because it's not as the original APPG definition. They spoke about how you could make a criticism of Islam as a religion, but the actual object of that is to hurt Muslim individuals. And if you start kind of gerrymandering definitions and meaning in that way, then everything becomes completely warped and porous, and you have no idea what's safe to say and what's not, what's offensive, because it's entirely subjective from the person who is taking offence at it.
And the idea that, that in the 21st century, that when a grown Pakistani man is saying, let's mess up these white slags about young white girls, the idea that someone could say that and it not be defined as racism is just absurd.
It makes a mockery of the word racism, because it is, as you say, it's taken on an entirely different meaning. And actually, and this is the case, I think, with the Islamophobia definition, that it actually ends up doing harm rather than good. So, for example, in cases of liberal Muslims or Muslims who are critical of certain aspects of Islamic belief or practices, or, for example, I've been doing some work with Muslim women, and they have very, very real problems that people face in their everyday life that they can't get solved because you can't have an honest public debate about the issues surrounding it, because non-Muslims are not allowed to say anything at all. And in some cases, Muslims are not allowed to say anything at all, because if they do, just like with Trevor Phillips, they'll get called an Uncle Tom or porch monkey, I think, is one of the things that I think Majid Nawaz at one point got called.
Completely.
And so actually it ends up hurting the people that it's pretending to take care of. And so the Islamophobia definition, I actually think, protects Islamists more than it protects Muslims.
But it also protects Islam, doesn't it? Yeah. Like, I think I know that we're talking about people, but in terms of an ideology, it also protects Islam. Like, if you can't criticize Islam, the idea, well, then that idea is protected. And we have to be honest, like, in Muslim communities, protection of Islam is, it's not down the bottom of our list of priorities. It's a very high thing. Like, this religion is the truth. It's from God. It must be protected.
And I think from the very beginning as well, Islamophobia was always bound up with the idea of blasphemy. So Salman Rushdie, for example, the Honeyford affair, I think as well, is an example that people have given for that. That, it's always been bound up with the idea of somehow insulting Islam as a religion. And that's something that's quite distinctive from anti-Muslim hatred. And actually, I think the APPG seemed to me quite explicit about their desire to move beyond the concept of anti-Muslim hatred as you have for every other religious group, into, as you were saying, Jimmy, into kind of the realm of microaggressions, structural racism, and all of these amorphous things that just becomes increasingly subjective.
To my mind, there's something quite specific in there as well, which strays into the realm of blasphemy law for me, and this is the ongoing debate about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his... the ongoing debate about at what point he consummated his marriage with Aisha, and for me, this is, this is a historical figure as far as I'm aware, and I will grant very likely existed, this gentleman, and so for us to not be able to have a debate about him and his history and what's written about him in the Hadiths, the same way we would, Henry VIII and talk about him, or Julius Caesar, or any other historical figure throughout history, but we're told in this new definition of Islamophobia that to talk about Muhammad in this way, to imply that he had sex with children, is an act of anti-Muslim bigotry. So that to me quite clearly, strays into the category of blasphemy law to forbid people from discussing that, as offensive as it might be for Muslims.
Even beyond that, the issue of you're talking. Obviously, Tom Holland has criticised the definition, the famous historian, because he's obviously done a lot of work himself on the history of Islam, and it has elements in it, as to do with Islam, to use the phrases used in the APPG report, conquering by the sword and subjugating groups under Islamic rule. It would mean that you would find it very difficult to actually do historical research or even talk about. So, for example, I wrote something today about a 9th century saint who was martyred because he insulted the Prophet Muhammad. And I actually felt nervous writing about that, because I was thinking someone is going to try and take this the wrong way, because you have to assume that the people who are reading you are dishonest or want to, bend it in a way that they can use to attack you in some way. And so it would be very difficult to, do work like Tom Holland has done, or even, work on the Yazidis, for example, or talking about the jizya tax that Muslim that minorities in Islamic countries used to have to pay. In Islamic Spain, for example, is I'm particularly thinking of, which is where this saint was martyred. But you wouldn't be able to talk about particular aspects of Islamic history. And we saw with it was only in October last year, I think it was, that Lord Singh had a BBC radio show that he actually resigned from, because he'd wanted to broadcast something to do with one of the Sikh gurus. And I apologise if I'm not getting the story exactly right, but he resigned because of that, and because the BBC were afraid that it would offend Muslim audiences, and so they wanted to censor him, but it was a perceived offence. Nobody had actually complained about it. The show hadn't been broadcast. They were just assuming, and this is how it ends up chilling free speech, because like I was saying earlier, you don't know what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say, and it gets to the point where you feel like if you say absolutely anything about Muslims or Islam, or try to have an honest conversation, as Trevor Phillips was doing when he was talking about issues to do with integration, or the fact that the people who were involved in these grooming gangs were Pakistani Muslims, you can't have an honest conversation anymore, because you're either self-censoring or you're being censored by the presumed offence on the part of the people who provide the platform, if that makes sense.
Completely. I think also it's not even stationary, is it? So, what is Islamophobia yesterday isn't Islamophobia today. So it's a completely broadening, ever-growing definition. So it is getting to the point that, because if you thought like 10 years ago that you couldn't say something about a Pakistani man raping white kids, we would have thought that was kind of ludicrous. But that's where we've got to in this day and age, that actually if you point out that something is a Muslim grooming gang, well then, are you bordering or teetering on Islamophobia? And we know that actually authorities were reticent to get involved because of this idea of being seen as racist. So it's not even like we can say, well, this is Islamophobia. We know what it is. So now Emma, Jimmy, Stephen, we can all do our writing and talk about what we want, because actually we could stay outside of that definition, and we would be safe. We wouldn't get, cancel culture or anything directed towards us. But we can't even guarantee that, because it's just consistently growing and getting wider and wider and wider. And the way it's manifesting, again, is just increasingly pernicious. So at the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain, like when we hire venues to do our events, we've been told things like, sorry, but we have a duty of care to our Muslim staff, so we need to consider whether this venue is appropriate.
Which is discrimination, I would say.
Completely. You'd never have you had like British humanists saying they wanted to rent out a venue? It wouldn't be like, hi, we have a duty of care to our Christian staff. That just wouldn't ever happen. But it's making it quite difficult to do anything that might place legitimate scrutiny upon Islam and Islamic communities, where and I think that's one of the most worrying things, is actually those of us who come from Islamic communities, we know that the way that this superstition has been able to infiltrate our lives in a consistent and prolonged way, the way it's been used to oppress gay people and the way that it's been used to marginalize and oppress women in our community, is completely due to a lack of scrutiny, because we were always told that Islam is perfect and there's nothing wrong with it. And when you're conditioned to believe that, when you see things going wrong in your community, you're not going to look at this perfect ideology as the cause. You're going to look at everything else. So often what we say in Muslim communities is, well, Islam is perfect, but Muslims are not. So if there's an issue in the Muslim community, I don't know, let's say it's the oppression of women in our community and or domestic violence in our community towards women, well, the reason for that is nothing to do with Islam, because Islam is perfect, but Muslims are not. So it's just about those men who are beating their wives. And no reference or correlation is allowed to be drawn between the verse in the Quran that says you can beat your wife. So what we really need is increased scrutiny around the ideology and how it has detrimental impact on our community. But the whole throes of Islamophobia moves that magnifying glass away from scrutiny over Islam.
Yeah, it's a kind of incremental authoritarianism to it, where even if you criticize it on the grounds of free speech, so something I always like to go back to, because I find it sort of particularly sinister, actually, that in the APPG report they say that criticisms on the grounds of free speech are themselves another form of anti-Muslim hatred that marginalises and stigmatises Muslims. So if you criticise the definition on the grounds of free speech, you're an Islamophobe. Yeah. And so it coalesces in a way that almost suffocates you. You can't even discuss it properly or push back against it, because you're immediately silenced. And so you can't have those discussions that Jimmy you were talking about, because it's impossible to have scrutiny when you can't be honest. And that is a sort of almost classical, like something from under communist rule or under totalitarianism, where your soul is essentially crushed because you're not able to say what you think is true. And once that is strangled out of existence, it's actually very difficult once you've torn that down to build that back up again, because you lose the ability to have those discussions and public debate.
A lot of people looking in from the outside on this conversation, not this conversation specifically, it's just three of us, you know what I mean? But I mean, the conversation in general will say, well, there's been a lot of noise made about anti-Semitism within the Labour Party and in general in our society, and the need to adopt a strong definition of anti-Semitism and implement rules and legislation to prevent these anti-Semites getting into positions of power or, getting away with spreading anti-Semitic propaganda and such. And that's generally a project I agree with. But so I was wondering what you'd say to people who say, well, how is this any different? It's just the same thing. But for Muslims, why should Muslims not get the same level as protection as the British Jewish population, for instance?
Yeah, I think that there's a false parity between the two definitions. So the Islamophobia definition tried actively to follow the sort of framework of the anti-Semitism definition. But the problem is that they actually don't have the core of them, they don't have in common, because anti-Semitism is explicitly racial. There are some elements to it to do with Zionism and criticism of Israel that is a whole other separate conversation, separate debate. But it doesn't veer as much into the concept of cultural racism, which is the foundation of the Islamophobia definition. It isn't anything really to do with Judaism as a religion. I think most people would feel comfortable saying pretty much anything about Judaism or Moses or, aspects of Jewish law. People would feel comfortable talking about that, or talking about women in Judaism, in Orthodox Judaism. And I don't think that you would have the sort of sense of restriction around that debate that you have with Islam and the fear of the accusation of Islamophobia. But the Islamophobia definition explicitly talks about, as you were saying before, about criticizing the Prophet Muhammad, making certain historical statements, saying that Muslims are more loyal to the Ummah than they are to Britain, even though that was something that was a finding in the Casey review, which would mean the findings of the Casey review are Islamophobic, which I'm sure that some people would actually say. And because it's based on this concept of cultural racism, it has to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate criticisms of Islam. And that is immediately dangerous territory. There's no talk in the anti-Semitism definition of legitimate and illegitimate criticisms of Judaism. There has the element to it to do with criticizing Israel, but that's because very often you get the word Zionism just used interchangeably with Jew as a way of getting around saying classic anti-Semitic tropes, but they're not. I think that there's a false parity there, but I don't think anybody is arguing that you shouldn't protect Muslim individuals. The concern is that it's actually trying to protect ideas, beliefs and practices, which is objectionable and is also something that is absolutely not suitable in a free society. You cannot legislate for that. And as I was saying before, that they were, with the definition, trying to go beyond anti-Muslim hatred into this realm of microaggression, structural racism, and all of these less tangible things. And I don't think that that's suitable to be legislated for in a free society, whereas the anti-Semitism definition is specifically racial, and it's about protecting Jewish individuals. It's nothing to do with protecting Judaism as a religion. And I don't think anybody, I can't think of, back before I was working on this area, I studied Jewish studies, and I can't think of a single person who argues for protecting Judaism as a religion in the same way that you get people protecting Islam from accusations of what are essentially blasphemy from within the Muslim community and outside as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's very rare that somebody will be targeted as a Jew for theological reasons. In this country, it's always, like you say, the anti-Semitic tropes that are levelled their way, or collective blame for the actions of Israel. But I suppose the one of the biggest casualties of this definition of Islamophobia has just broken the news the last day or two, would be Trevor Phillips. Now, to my mind, Trevor Phillips has been a staunch anti-racist for his entire public career. I think he was either responsible for coining the term Islamophobia, or he certainly popularised it. Yeah,
he was involved with the 2000, was it? It was the 1997 Runnymede report, which basically made it popularise the term. Really.
Right. Okay, well, it's just been reported in the news that he's been suspended from the Labour Party, reportedly because he made past comments about Pakistani Muslim men abusing children, which Pakistani Muslim men did abuse children, so there's something very Orwellian going on here.
How many fingers am I holding up?
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure where we go from here, because, I mean, he's a cast-iron example of the dangers we've just been discussing, really, aren't we? It has happened. Somebody has been caught in the crossfire of this new definition, and on the face of it, seems rather unfairly.
Yeah, I mean, he actually said, he wrote an op-ed in the Times and said that he didn't expect himself to be the first casualty of the definition, because he'd warned against. He wrote a very lengthy report for Policy Exchange. And had warned against this being weaponised, basically, against dissidents. I think he's been in the Labour Party for about 30 years, and in all of that time has been a sort of champion of anti-racism. And so it's all, as you were saying, it's Orwellian, but it's almost funny in a sinister and tragic way that the first casualty of this would be Trevor Phillips, because it shows the absurdity of it, and actually in a way has kind of cheapened the whole debate, because it really has shown it up for what it is. If you go through the charges of the Labour Party against him, there's nothing in there really that you'd have to work really hard to find something in there that was objectionable. It doesn't come anywhere near close to anti-Muslim hatred. I think it's clearly just being used against him because he's a critic, basically.
Jimmy, how I mean, is there any way we can talk about Muslim grooming gangs without being accused of ulterior motives or being racist? Because, I mean, let's be honest, on the face of it, it does sound like something that a racist would make up. It sounds like some absolute far-right fantasy, doesn't it? The idea that predominantly white girls were targeted by, groups, gangs of Muslim Pakistani men and raped and tortured. It does sound like something a racist lunatic would make up, but unfortunately it just happens to be the truth of it, and we need to deal with the reality of the situation and talk about it honestly. And I just wonder, is there a way of approaching this at all that won't generate as much heat?
So I think the answer to that question is a big fat no. And we just have to get comfortable with that. Yeah. So I think if you think you're going to be able to talk about Pakistani grooming gangs and not be accused of Islamophobia, you're probably talking to people like us, yeah, who are quite au fait with this narrative and this discourse, and understand that despite that accusation being leveled at us, we must continue the conversation nonetheless. Yeah. And so people often ask me, like, actually, Jimmy, it's okay for you, you're Pakistani, but as a white male, particularly as a straight white male, if I want to side with gay ex-Muslims or gay Muslims, how do I do this without being called an Islamophobe? Or if I want to stand up for Muslim women's rights, or if I want to stand up against the veil, how do I do this without being called an Islamophobe? And my answer to that has always been, just be consistent. Do exactly what the rest of us are doing. It doesn't matter that I'm Pakistani and that you're white. We'll both get called Islamophobes. We just have to deal with that as part of the discourse until actually the numbers become so vast and that the term becomes so farcical, as we're seeing with it being leveled against Trevor Phillips, that it just starts to lose its power. Yeah, I really think that's what we're going to have to do, is that people are going to throw Islamophobia around at absolutely everything, that it becomes meaningless. In the same way now that when people, the thought that somebody would call me a racist before, you would have, 10, 15 years ago, would have really given me pause to stop and think about what I was saying. Now when I get called a racist, or sometimes a racist Islamophobe, I really just take it in my stride, because it really is becoming...
it's the boy who cried wolf.
Yeah.
Exactly. The terms are being stretched so broadly that they're losing their meaning, which is so incredibly sad. With the word racism anyway. I think it's so incredibly sad that...
It's the same with the word fascist as well. That it's actually dangerous if you overuse words like that.
Yeah, completely. I just want to draw one, focus to one thing that happened on that show. Do you guys remember the lady who was wearing a hijab? And at one point she said, I think she was talking about that baroness saying that, she had quoted her saying that Islamophobia has now passed the dinner table test. Yeah. And she was saying that, and the girl actually said, the girl in the hijab in the audience actually said, people think that they can criticize Islam and that it's okay.
Yes.
Like she said that with such incredulity that we would think it's okay to criticize Islam. And I thought, that really sums it up in the Muslim community, actually, because when we say that criticizing Islam has passed the dinner table test, in a Muslim house, that's just unacceptable. The idea that you would all be sat at dinner and somebody would be saying, you know what, I don't think that hadith about
that surah is a bit shit.
I don't think. Yeah, exactly. I think verse 434 where it was about beating your wife. I think that surah is a bit shit. Or maybe God got that wrong. Like you couldn't. It's not acceptable to have that kind of a conversation in a Muslim household at the dinner table. You end up getting shunned. There might be some violence thrown in, depending on how the family dynamics are, right? But you could definitely end up getting shunned by your family for doing that kind of critique of Islam. So for us as a community, having this idea that you could bring the religion to the table, the only religion that matters, because we could totally do this at dinner table about Hinduism, Christianity, Buddhism and Judaism. Like we could have a laugh at the dinner table criticizing those religions. But if we were doing that with Islam, it's not okay. And when that woman talked about it, people thinking that they can criticize Islam and it being okay, it really just spoke to the dynamic in our community, that the level of sophistication around criticism of Islam is such that we cannot imagine or we cannot be comfortable with the fact that anybody would be able to criticize it in such a way, pull it to pieces and say this is a ridiculous superstition. That's just not something that's okay. So it makes sense then that, we're working as a community very, very arduously to generate some protective mechanisms to protect this thing, which is more valuable to us than our own lives.
I worry as well, because I feel like we don't, in the UK especially, I don't think we hold Christians to any sort of archetypal standard when it comes to adherence. However, the sort of the norm we have in our heads for the authentic Muslim, should I say, is overtly conservative. It's one that wears the veil, the one that abstains from alcohol, the one that prays several times a day, the one that always goes to mosque. And I just don't understand why we recognise that conservative religion is bad generally in the context of, say, Christianity, and we would stand against that, whereas we not only accept it within the Muslim community, we outright endorse it and hold that up as the gold standard, not only in society but in the media as well. So I think there's a battle to be won here in trying to make people understand that the Islam they have in their head is actually overtly conservative and quite anti-liberalism.
Which is weird, isn't it? Because they've kind of got this stereotype of what a Muslim is, and anybody who diverges from that is almost viewed as pale. So if you're a liberal Muslim or a feminist Muslim, or you don't fall into the obvious category, you're not a woman wearing a hijab or a burqa or a niqab, then you sort of fall outside of their stereotype, and even the non-Muslim community then sees you as being somehow insufficiently Muslim and is inclined to side with the more conservative ones. So I find it also interesting you're saying about the dinner table test and criticising Muhammad. If you had this proliferation of phobias where every religion, and this is a bit like Kant's categorical imperative, can this be universalised? If we protected every religion in the same way, then in the same way that Sikhs are concerned that they can't make particular statements about their faith because that would be construed as Islamophobic because their faith was born out of conflict with Islam.
Yeah.
Then what about the Muslims who preach on Speaker's Corner every Sunday saying that Jesus was a Muslim? Because surely that is something that would be, if Christians were sensitive, that's something that they would feel very offended by, in the same way that's, saying something about Muhammad. And surely trying to provoke people with giant signs that say Jesus is a Muslim it's intended to provoke. And I don't see how you can hold them to different standards in that way.
Yeah. I think there's something here that religious conservatism point is really interesting because, and it's just I guess explores this with me because it's just going to come to mind. There's something in this religious conservatism or Islamic religious conservatism which manifests quite visibly, doesn't it? So when we think about it, we think about if you're a brother, you've got a big beard and you're visibly Muslim. If you're a sister, you've got your hijab on or you've got your veil on, and so you're very visibly Muslim because that goes hand in hand with our archetypal images of Muslim religious conservatives. There's something in that which is anathema to white colonialism. And I think that's why it's endorsed in this anti-racism era. Yeah? Like, put on your veil, women, keep on your hijabs, because that is really standing in opposition to white supremacy. And because we live in a society where everything now is white supremacy, that championing these visible demarcations of your cultural heritage, which is Islam, is to be applauded.
From a non-Muslim perspective as well, it's quite ironic that it's almost is a kind of Orientalism, isn't it? The almost like the way that people, particularly academics, seem to be enthralled by this particular understanding of what a Muslim looks like and what a Muslim is and what Muslim belief and practice is on the more conservative end of the spectrum. But when you see it applied to other religions, to Judaism and Christianity in particular, I mean, there's hell to pay whenever a figure in the church comes out, for example, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, and says something that goes against the general woke consensus. Whereas often the people who actually advocate for the definition talk about Muslim exceptionalism. But actually, I think this seems to be the form of Muslim exceptionalism. And the question is why, from the perspective of non-Muslims, why are they viewed in this way and treated in this way? And I've spoken to lots of liberal Muslims who actually find this very insulting, that they almost feel that it's somehow infantilizing, that their beliefs somehow need extra protection, and that actually in a free society you should have healthy engagement with. It's like when John Stuart Mill talks about the opportunity to exchange truth for error and error for truth and so on, that you need that. You need to be able to engage with ideas that may be false or may be true in order to understand the truth of your own beliefs. And also from the perspective of, say, conservative Christianity, I think it should be fine to hold a variety of views about on the conservative end of the spectrum about, if the church holds, particular traditional views surrounding the sacrament of marriage and so on. But it needs to be in the context of free, open debate. That I don't think other religions are as, or at least, and again, I'm speaking in general terms, and I don't think that this actually applies to all Muslims, because there are obviously lots of liberal Muslims like you, Jimmy, who are sort of more open to engaging with ideas. But I don't know where this sort of desire to protect Islam is coming from exactly.
Yeah, I think we should clarify that I'm an ex-Muslim before, there's the influx of phone calls onto the podcast. A whole list of comments.
Converted you.
So, and I think there's something there, Emma, about stagnation as well. Like, because of that, because, other religions are allowed to have this conversation, and it takes it back to what I was talking about earlier about scrutiny, like this need to place Islam under scrutiny, because that will allow us to pick it apart and say, you know what, this is a ridiculous superstition that has been holding back our society, particularly when we look at the struggle for rights around women and gay people. Like this superstition has so much to answer for in terms of getting in the way of our rights and actively fostering and creating an environment where we can be persecuted mercilessly. Yeah, but by not allowing us that ability to scrutinize it, we're kept stagnated. And, when we look at women's rights across the Muslim world, or when we look at gay rights across the Muslim world, the level that they are at really speaks to the amount of stagnation and lack of scrutiny and dialogue that we have around Islam.
There's a lot of people being robbed of an opportunity to flourish. I was never religious. I was, culturally Christian, I suppose, brought up in a Christian society. I went to a faith school, but it never really stuck. However, seeing comedy routines about Christianity and, reading more about criticism surrounding religion just made me realise that actually it's okay to question these things. And by doing so, it prevented me from maybe buying into an ideology that wouldn't have been good for me in the long run. It helped free my mind a lot more, being in an environment where it's actually okay to question Christianity. Nobody seems to care. However, like you say, in sort of very tight-knit Muslim communities, it's completely forbidden to do so. And not only that, when they go... when they venture outside of the community, people who are non-Muslims have been affected by this chilling effect on free speech surrounding the issue of Islam. And worse than that, a lot of people fetishize it, as I think we've touched on as well. So this is a huge loss for these individuals stuck in these societies, isn't it?
In many ways, this is one of the places where I guess we would expect to be able to have that dialogue. Like if you're in Saudi or if you're in Pakistan, the repercussions are so severe that you are curtailed from having that conversation. But when we're living in a Western liberal democracy and we've got, such an interconnected world because of the internet, people are expecting us to have these conversations. Women in Saudi Arabia are expecting us to have these conversations over here to discredit religious condemnation of their activities and then bring that conversation to light so that it can cascade across the globe and lead to their emancipation. And the same thing around gay rights as well. So but we would expect for them to not be able to have that access to that conversation because of the repercussions in their countries. But to think that over here, that when we try to have these conversations, what's happening to Trevor Phillips as an example, it's just mind-blowing. Like I was saying earlier, it's like you really couldn't script this with increased irony as to how it's actually occurring.
Yeah, I think it's also the case with sort of moving between religions as well. You were talking about people moving away from religion, but also obviously apostasy is a big issue for some Muslim communities, and that's obviously something that's very frowned upon, and presumably some people would like to protect against that happening, people maybe converting to Christianity and so on. And I think that you need to have, in order to have true religious freedom, you have to have the ability to engage with these ideas and to, I think in general, and this is sort of very much kind of post-Brexit Britain, what kind of society do we want to live in? I personally want to live in a society that's almost like a new renaissance, where everybody is engaging intelligently and honestly and fairly with each other's ideas. And at the beginning of the conversation, you were talking about steel manning rather than straw manning, because there's always, and I think that this is really at the core of it, there's this sense of distrust. You can't trust the person, it may or may not know, who is reading you or listening to you. You can't trust that they're going to give you a fair hearing and engage with your ideas properly. And so we do stagnate. We can't move forward because we're not honestly and sincerely engaging with each other.
Yeah, bringing it back to John Stuart Mill, he spoke about living truth, didn't he, in that regard, that if you don't challenge your beliefs and your principles frequently, then they just become frozen in time, almost like you're reciting dogma. I always love to recommend a good bit of John Stuart Mill on this podcast. So if anyone hasn't got a copy of On Liberty, I'm sure you can find it. But this is absolutely flown by. I think we've got a good chunk in there, and I just thought I'd throw a bit of time open for either of you to tie any loose ends up you'd like to, or just sing if you're that way inclined, or whatever you want. So Jimmy, I don't know if there's anything you want to get off your mind.
Yeah, and I was just wondering if with this would even come into the conversation, but I didn't realize there was going to be an AOB section, so maybe this is the best place to put it in. So yesterday was International Women's Day, and we went to the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain held an event, and at the event that they held in London, they played this film, and it was called No Longer Without You, and the director and the lead actress were there. So basically, the film is about a woman who's like 50 years old and her mother, who's however much older than her. And they're I think they're Turkish, so and their family lives in Turkey. And the film is an exploration of the daughter talking to her mother about when she was shunned by her family. And so Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain, we're focusing this year on the act of shunning and how it's psychological torture. But in this film, she sits down with her mum and she talks to her about, before you loved me, you loved the rules. Before you loved me, you loved the community first. The community's rules, the religious rules that came between us, put this massive wedge between us. And throughout this film, which I think was only about half an hour long, there's just the two people, the mother and the daughter, who are both actors, but also the story is theirs. Yeah, so they're very much talking about their story, and they're just having this conversation with each other. And at one point, but in this film, they're having the conversation this time in front of the rest of the family. Like there's a brother there as well. And in the film, the girl tells her mother that she had an abortion because she couldn't tell her mother that she was pregnant with this guy's baby. And the mother tells her, I wish you had told me. We would have just arranged for you to get married earlier and you could have kept that child. And when you're watching this movie, like everybody in the audience was on the verge of tears watching this movie. But a lot of the content in that movie would have been classified as Islamophobic, or the movie in itself, even though it was made by Turkish women, would have been categorized as racist because it was painting all Muslims in one light. And the mother is a hijabi, the daughter is an ex-Muslim. But when I was speaking to the director and the actor, they were telling us that as they went around Turkey performing this theatre piece in the different venues with Muslim audiences, I think they were actually performing it in Holland. Sorry, not in Turkey, in Holland, as they were going around Holland, because that's where the actress is from, but they're from Turkish heritage. That when they had Muslim women, like when they did it at community centres and they were performing this piece, they didn't know how they were going to respond. But what actually happened was after they performed the play, which has now become a film, the people from the Muslim community were coming up to them and saying, God, we feel so relieved that you put on this play because now we can talk about it. Because in this day and age, in the 21st century, everybody's got a daughter who's not a bloody virgin before she gets married, or everyone's got a son who's got somebody else pregnant before they were married. But culturally and from a religious perspective, these are huge taboos that should not happen. So when we have this film that's made and we have that play going around the country, that is facilitating a dialogue about actual real-life events and issues in our communities, where on one hand people would try and label that as Islamophobic and stereotyping Muslims as regressive or backwards in their views towards women. On the other hand, we have actual women who are in veils, in hijabs, going up to the actress and her mum and saying, we're so thankful that you did this play because now we can talk about these issues as a community because you're showing us that a daughter can now speak to her mum about the fact that she had an abortion, which is something, in our community you would never do. If you went and had an abortion, you just wouldn't talk about it. You'd pretend it never happened. And in one part of the movie, the mum says, so long as nobody knows, it's okay. It doesn't matter what the action is, just so long as nobody knows about it, it's okay. And, that scrutiny is exactly the type of scrutiny that we need. So when people try and move with this label of Islamophobia in the thinking that they're protecting Muslim minority groups, actually, that's not even a consensus.
Oh, they're coming for you, Jimmy.
Community. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, sorry, I got distracted there by the the London knife crime. Yeah.
So they're coming for you, Jimmy.
They are indeed. So my point was just that dialogue that people seek to stem from happening actually benefits Muslims and ex-Muslims and the whole Muslim community. You can't stop this conversation from happening forever. It's going to happen. We should get on board with it happening.
I think actually, just to add to that, that's also the case with, so Baroness Cox has been trying for years to get legislation through to try and protect women from unregistered Islamic marriages because they end up getting divorced in sort of almost a snap of the fingers of the husband. And then they're left with absolutely no marital rights. They end up getting tossed on the tides of the Sharia courts that try to get money out of them or to get custody of their children given to the father and that kind of thing. And some of these women are have been or continue to be in the most horrific domestic situations. And one of the reasons why it seems nothing is properly being done is because there's this sense of sort of like group rights that, this is something that happens in the Muslim community. This isn't something for domestic law to deal with. This is a social issue. But also sort of reticence to deal with the problem because no one wants to engage with issues to do with the Muslim community because they are seen as a separate community, which is kind of counter to what the left, usually the left, are saying when it comes to Islamophobia, that it's actually, they think that it's, the far right see it as us and them, but actually with the group rights, it is a sense of sort of us and them, and we're not going to step in and take care of them and make sure that they've got the same rights that women have throughout the country, particularly with respect to the marital rights. And so I think actually it's very much like, we saw with the Lutfa Rahman case in Tower Hamlets or Trojan Horse or even Rotherham, where there's this hesitance to deal with the problem because you're afraid of being called a racist or an Islamophobe. And there's a reticence on the part of the government as well because they just think it's not worth the political cost of getting involved with that. But in the meantime, people are actually getting hurt. And you're storing up trouble for the future. And going back to the point about integration, this is something that actually Trevor Phillips, one of the things that he'd said that Labour Party took umbrage to was about the Muslim community and integration. And you can't solve those issues until you're able to have these conversations and to move away from this fear of being called Islamophobic or racist, because like you were saying before, that they're protected in a silo, and it's sort of viewed as, well, we'll just let them get on with it and never mind that these women are in horrific situations and no one's helping them. I mean, I read a story from a case study of one woman who had come over as an asylum seeker and then found it unfathomable that the UK wasn't protecting her. So I think there's a kind of there's so much ideology involved in the Islamophobia debate and in identity politics more broadly, and so much emphasis on group rights and the rights of ideas to be protected, that in the meantime people are actually getting hurt, and their freedom to choose and their freedom to think is being gradually eroded. And I think that's something that is particularly important because it was said, someone just today was talking about the Trevor Phillips thing, describing it as Orwellian, and quite rightly. And I think that one of the things that Orwell did so fantastically was describing the kind of mundane way that totalitarianism creeps up on you and sort of almost like a python wraps itself around the human soul and crushes it. And I think that this is how those sorts of things begin. We're distracted talking about all of the identity politics, woke stuff. Meanwhile, the real serious problems in society are not being spoken about and can't be spoken about.
I think that's a great point. Well, I want to thank you both for coming on and talking about this so late in the evening. Jimmy, is there anything you'd like to point people towards? Maybe some social network addresses where they can send some foul-mouthed abuse, or some web addresses?
Yeah, please do. It's always welcome. So I'd like to point people towards, well, just keep your eyes open, actually, for our website at Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain on the events page. So pretty soon you'll start seeing stuff coming up around Gay Pride, because we're coming up to that time of year. So Emma, Stephen, you are both welcome to come and march with us in Gay Pride, and hold some signs with us. So I think just, for people to keep their eyes open around that. And again, I always have to just do a quick mention of Free Hearts, Free Minds, which is another organisation that I do a lot of work with, and we help ex-Muslims in Muslim-majority countries with mental health support over Skype, like giving them 6 sessions to work with somebody in the UK to kind of talk about how their life is and helping them find direction and moving forward. So check out both of those organisations when you can. If you want to find me, I'm Jimmy London on Facebook, and the same on Twitter as well, if you want to follow me.
Great. Emma, where can people find you for more information?
Well, I'm on Twitter.
That was your first mistake.
My handle is not an easy one to speak. It's Emma_A_Webb. But if anybody's interested in reading more about the debate around the Islamophobia subject, we recently, not so recently, last year actually, published an anthology with contributions from people all across the political and religious spectrum, Sikhs, Muslims, atheists. We even had a small contribution from Richard Dawkins in there. So we really, as well as Christian Concerns, and the National Secular Society. So we really had the complete broad range of contributions to it, just sort of outlining what people's concerns are about the definition. So it's a good kind of first stop if anybody's interested in some of the issues surrounding the subject. And other than that, I suppose just watch this space, because we're doing a lot of work on the area.
Emma, where would they access that report?
And so that's on the Civitas website. So all of our reports can be accessed, the free PDFs online. If
you forward me a link to that later, I shall include it in the show notes so people can just go and click it when they're listening.
Brilliant, thank you.
Could you also send it to me on WhatsApp?
Yep, I'll send it into the WhatsApp group.
Awesome.
Cheers.
All right,
Brilliant.
Guys. Well, thank you very much for your time again. This has been lovely, and we'll have to catch up and do this again another time.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spellchecker podcast. The podcast is a one-man operation produced in my spare time away from my day job, and I love making it for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider lending some support. The show is entirely listener supported. I don't sell anything, I don't run ads, and given the alternative and unpopular focus of my content, it's very unlikely to find a sponsor. So there are a number of ways you can support and chip in and help improve the show and give me more time to produce more content. You can become a patron supporter and pledge a monetary amount per month or per episode by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. If you can't lend monetary support right now, don't worry, there's other ways you can help the podcast too. You can share it on your various social media networks, or take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen to it. Your support is massively appreciated. Thank you. Think we've all learned something here today?